Well, here we are ready to go again, and welcome back. Let me just take a few minutes here at the beginning to just kind of summarize the points that I've been trying to make and going over this to make sure you get the sort of the broad picture of what I'm trying to tell you about the British colonies in the continent of North America, the colonies that eventually became the United States, which is what we study. And the point I've been trying to make is that those people had substantial liberty. That's why I like the title of the book, because that's kind of the theme that I use. The book is titled Give Me Liberty, and that's the theme that I want to stress here in the class. And the point is that the Americans, as British subjects, as subjects of the British Empire, had substantial liberty. They had it all along. To some extent, they had it as British subjects. All British subjects probably had more freedom, more liberty than other people in Western Europe, than especially the subjects of the French and the Spanish monarchs. They had the idea that land ownership equaled freedom. And especially in America, much more in America than in England or anywhere else, large numbers of white men owned land. The number I've given you is about 75%. Now, as landowners, as people with freedom, as the people who were considered the real bulwarks of society, they also got to vote. And so they had their own assemblies, they had significant local self-government control. They controlled, they voted for, they elected their representatives, and their representatives governed them. Especially their representatives, and only the representatives, taxed them. So they did pay taxes, but it was assessed only by the representatives that they elected. So this is all substantial freedom. This is much more than anywhere else on the planet, and much more than anywhere else in the British Empire. The British Empire had a few people who could vote, and they did not have an absolute monarch as other countries did. So in that sense, England was ahead of other countries, but within the English Empire, the Americans were further ahead by far than anybody else. So Americans have significant freedom. Now on top of that, on top of this kind of political freedom, they basically had freedom of religion. Now technically they didn't. Officially, the law was they were all members of the Church of England, and they were required to be members of the Church of England. But that wasn't really enforced. That was not part of their daily life. Realistically, although only freedom of religion only existed on paper in 3 colonies, the reality was that it prevailed throughout most of the colonies. They had such little things as trial by jury, which was a very important thing to all British subjects. And as British subjects, we got that. So Americans have substantial freedom. Now, having said this, we always have to add the important caveat. We always have to add that this applies only to white males. And, you know, there are people in this country, you see people who want to run around and say, oh, America's the greatest country ever, and we've always had freedom, and da-da-da, we've always been the greatest stuff. Well, okay, yes, we're far ahead of other people at that time, but let's not forget that women were not included in that concept of freedom, and that's half the people, and that the whole concept was based on ownership of land, and the only reason so many people could own land was we took it away from the Native Americans. So let's not lose sight of the fact that America was founded on a basic principle of taking assets from other people. You know, stealing if you want. That's the basis of American freedom. You can't deny that, and you don't want to. There's people who just sort of want to ignore that. They just want to make, oh, America's the greatest country. Well, come on. Yeah, America is far ahead of other countries, but only because we took away land from Indians. And then we discovered that there was a lot of opportunity here. There was a lot of opportunity for making a lot of money, for being successful, becoming independent, becoming self-reliant. You could afford a very high standard of living. We had the highest standard of living of anybody in the world. But to do that, we needed labor. There were many more resources than we could use with just the people that we had. So we brought in people from Africa to be slaves, and we forced them to be slaves, we forced them to be property in order to make the system work. So that is another part of the whole foundation that you just can't deny. That people in this country today who like to walk around and brag about how great America is, they just don't want to admit that to a very great extent that depended on having people, those from African ancestry, who had to be slaves. That's part of America. That was an inescapable part of American freedom. Okay. So, now, our local governments, as I said, had substantial power. They basically ran their colonies. And they did this despite the fact that the law said that they were really under the control of royal governors, and the royal governors were supposed to have power over them. But that just didn't ever work. That was not the reality. The reality was the term that I've used for you, salutary neglect. The only reason this worked was because England just chose to look the other way, or their system was too incompetent, their system was such a mess. Their whole imperial administration, in contrast to the Spanish administration, the English imperial administration was just a jumble of laws that were not always enforced. People didn't even know what they were, and the system was just extremely inefficient. And with the English all in such a chaotic state, the Americans just seized power and governed themselves. And specifically, I stressed that the English government never taxed Americans. That was not part of the system. Americans taxed themselves through their own assemblies. Now, there's an exception to that, at least at first glance, and I need to acknowledge this one sort of seeming contradiction to everything that I've been telling you. In 1733, Parliament passed a law called, the contracted form of it, is the Molasses Act. And that required Americans to pay a tax on molasses, which is extracted from sugar, and so it would apply to all forms of sugar and all stages of its refining and processing and so forth, that would be imported into the British colonies of North America from the non-English Caribbean countries. And the two largest examples would be Cuba of the Spanish Empire, Haiti of the French Empire, smaller colonies throughout the Caribbean, several Dutch colonies. None of their islands are as large as Cuba or Santo Domingo, but the Americans were importing a lot of sugar from the non-British West Indies. And those imports were now subject to a very substantial tax. And the purpose of this is very consistent with English goals of mercantilism. The goal is to help the sugar planters on the British West Indies. The large islands would be Jamaica, Bermuda, smaller ones, Barbados, a couple other smaller ones, Kitts, and so forth. And what the British government was trying to do here, which as I say is very standard mercantilist practice, have Americans, if they're going to import sugar, which we were doing, import it only from the British West Indies. So there's a tax on it from the foreign West Indies. So this is a tax. This is, that's what it says. If you import sugar from Cuba, you have to pay a tax on it. That's tax. But that was not the purpose of the law. The law set the tax so high as to be prohibitive. The point was to prevent altogether Americans from buying non-British sugar. The tax was not supposed to be collected. It was not intended to be a source of revenue for the Royal Treasury. They're not trying to make money on this. It's not a way to get money out of the Americans. It's a way to regulate their trade in such a way that they trade only with the British West Indies. As such, it's like a lot of other regulations. England, as I told you, had lots of laws on the books. I just gave you a very, very simplistic overview of the laws that England imposed, but there was a lot of them. This is one of them. This is one of the many supplements to the whole code of navigation laws that regulated trade. And it's a trade regulation. It's not a tax. Now, had it been enforced, it would have imposed a significant hardship on American merchants. Americans engaged in significant levels of trade with the non-British West Indies. We had a lot of trade with Cuba. We had a lot of trade with the Dutch West Indies. We had a lot of trade with Haiti. We imported a lot of sugar there. There was a tremendous demand for sugar in North America. We grew some of our own, but not nearly enough. We also imported a lot of sugar from the British West Indies. That's the legal sugar. We imported a lot of that, but there was still a great demand for sugar in the North American colonies. People wanted sugar for their cooking. As I've said before, they wanted to make donuts, recognizing that donuts are the basis of a healthy diet. They used a lot of the sugar to distill it into rum. Rum making was one of the few industrial activities, one of the few manufacturing activities that went on in America. We had rum distilleries in most American cities, and rum's raw material is sugar. So we imported a lot of sugar for many purposes, and the demand just exceeded what could be produced either in North America itself, down in South Carolina and Georgia, the only places where you could grow sugar in North America, more than what we could import from the British West Indies. So we just imported a lot of tea from the non-British West Indies. And even though that law was on the books, we imported a lot of sugar. And that law was simply not enforced. As far as we know, most of the other regulations, and there's a lot of regulations, most of them probably were obeyed. We don't have much evidence that there was significant smuggling of many products into America. We don't have much evidence, there's no suggestion that there was a lot of illegal trading activity, except in the area of non-British West Indies sugar. And we know that imports of that, which are illegal, imports of that were very substantial. Many American merchants made a lot of money by engaging in what is smuggling. It's illegal importing sugar. And those people were not considered criminals in their own communities. Many of them were distinguished residents of their towns or their cities. One of the best known smugglers was a guy named John Hancock in Boston, whose one of the stars of the community. He's one of the most respected members of the community. He's a longtime member of the assembly. He's a member of his church, donated significant money to his church, was a very highly regarded person. He was also considered the king of smugglers because smuggling the illegal sugar was a large part of his whole business activity. So, this just goes on. Now, it's illegal. So the question is, why did it go on? Why did England let that illegal activity? They passed the law. Why didn't they bother to enforce it? Well, first of all, the smuggling really didn't hurt the British West Indies sugar planters. These are some very wealthy people. The West Indies was much more characterized by large plantations owned by wealthy people in London, and with the labor provided entirely by slaves. There are very few small farmers in the Caribbean. The landowners are mostly big, wealthy London planters who were very wealthy people. And they were making so much money as it was, they couldn't make any more if the law had been enforced. They're selling all the sugar they can produce anyway, so the smuggling wasn't really hurting them. The law is designed to ensure that they got all the trade. Well, they were getting it all, and then there was still so much left over that the Americans could smuggle, and it didn't hurt the British planters. So they didn't really care. And they weren't after saying, well, you've got to stop this smuggling because the smuggling is hurting us. It wasn't hurting them. So it's easy to overlook it. And then you ask the question of who would have enforced it if it was going to be enforced. And the answer is the royal governors. That's their job. They're there to enforce the laws. They are there to, and the laws mostly involve all of these trade regulations in the whole Code of Navigation Acts. I told you the governors would get their instructions, and then they'd go off to be a governor for 3 years. Well, the instructions almost always said, enforce the navigation laws. That's the prime responsibility of a governor, enforce the laws. And the most important laws, the laws that England cares about, are these trade regulations. That's what the English Empire cares about. Trade regulations, enforce the Navigation Acts. And so the governors would go off, and they'd take up their position, and the smuggling is going on, the sugar is coming in, boats are sailing in from Cuba with big loads of sugar, and everybody who's selling it is making money and getting rich and happy as could be. And it's going on, and the governors they knew to look the other way. If they had the power to enforce it if they wanted to. I mean, they've got power. They are the governor. They can do whatever they want, theoretically. But if they had wanted to enforce the law, first of all, they'd have had to have set up some sort of an enforcement agency. They'd have had to set up some sort of a customs service or something. And then the question immediately becomes, well, who's going to pay for that? Who's going to pay the salary of the customs agents? Well, the assembly isn't, and there's no other money. So you can't do it. If you had found some way to finance such an operation, some governor says, I'm going to stop this smuggling, and I'm going to set up some sort of a customs service, and we're going to impose taxes on all the people who come in, and we're going to get revenue, and we're going to use that revenue to run the customs service, something like, you could do something like that. And so then you could start arresting all of these smugglers. And then what happens? Well, this is the British Empire. What happens? They go to trial. They go before a judge. First of all, who appoints the judge? The judge is basically appointed by or selected by the leading members of the community who are in the assembly. The local Americans are going to be the ones who are choosing the judges. So the judge is going to be a friend, neighbor, maybe relative of one of the smugglers. So you've got a judge who's going to be against you. And the bottom line is, the decision on whether this smuggler that you've caught goes to jail or not is made by Who? A jury, a local jury. You're not going to get any convictions. And every English governor, who, as I said, were not the smartest guys in the world, but they were smart enough to figure out if they tried to enforce that law, they're, first of all, not going to accomplish anything. All they're going to do is arrest a bunch of people who are going to be turned loose by jurors of their friends and neighbors. And all you're going to do is antagonize the assembly, and they're going to cut off your salary and so forth. Just leave it alone. Just look the other way. Pretend it doesn't happen. So, sort of that's part of this whole system of salutary neglect. That now here's a law. Most of the laws didn't hurt the Americans. Very few of the laws really imposed any hardship on Americans. This is one that would. So we just ignored it. And the system, the British Empire, the way the whole empire was set up with the Board of Trade and all of the enforcement and everything like that, no way to enforce it. It's not part of the system. It doesn't work. So that's part of the whole British Empire, And looking at all these regulations, these laws, yeah, there's a lot of laws. There's and a lot of paperwork and a lot of hassle complying with all these laws, a lot of paperwork you have to fill out, and there's all these forms you have to go through and everything like that to verify that the trade is legal. Okay, it's annoying. And then there are places like where, American tobacco farmers can't sell their tobacco directly to the Dutch cigar makers. They have to go through English merchants. They could make more money if they could go directly to the Dutch. So, okay, there's hardships there. There's limitations. There's restrictions. We don't have a free economy. This is not like Adam Smith and his free market that he's going to advocate many years down the line. It's not a free economy. It's controlled. It's a mercantilist economy. It's controlled by the government. But how bad could it have been? The standard of living in America was the highest of anywhere in the world. People had a longer life. The infant mortality rate, which would be shocking to us, I don't have numbers in my head, but if it was the same thing today, it would be terrible. But by the standards of the day, comparing North America with the rest of the Western world, we have the lowest infant mortality rate, the highest life expectancy. People lived well. We had a very high protein diet. There was a lot of protein in our diet. We had a lot of meat. We were meat eaters. We produced a lot, mostly pork. We produced a lot of pigs and had a lot of meat to eat. So to supplement our diet, we had more protein in our diet than other people. Just physically, Americans were bigger than other people. They grew taller and stronger because they had better diets. We're doing well. So I think I left you last class with the question, why did Americans want to get out? Why did they want to leave the British Empire in which they had so much freedom? And to start this out, we can give an answer to sort of summarize the whole thing, and then we're going to spend the next couple classes looking at this in more detail. But to kind of give you the introduction in a few words, England tried to change the system. The system was working very well for Americans. England, for many years, for decades, for over a century, was perfectly willing to just kind of look the other way because they were making so much money off of it anyway. But at a certain point, people in England said, this system is not working. We need to change it. We need to fix it. And that's going to be sort of the theme of what I'll be talking about the rest of today and in the next classes next week and so on. What started all of that? Why did England, after living with salutary neglect for decades and having it just go on and on and on and on. Why did they suddenly decide to change? Well, the reason starts with a war between England and France. Now, for more than a century, England and France had been fighting wars on again, off again, over issues that frankly had nothing to do with America. I haven't talked about them because they don't involve us. It involves us only because we're colonies of England, and England's got these wars, but they don't affect us. And without getting into the details, because it takes too much time and it's not really relevant to us, or we don't need to get into the details. England and France fought 3 different wars from the 1680s down to the 1740s. These were wars that had to do with events in Europe. England and France were involved in all kinds of power struggles in Europe. The issues are very complex. To study European history this time, it takes a lot of time to try to straighten out all of the complexities, all of the diplomatic hostilities between England and France, the wars, the allies. Both England and France have allies in those wars. Allies change. It's very complex. But as I say, it doesn't have anything to do with America. Now, in America, we refer to those wars by the monarch at the time. And just to tell you, there's, not that you would really need to learn this, but there's King William's War, there's Queen Anne's War, and there's King George's War, because those were the monarchs at the time. And Americans used those names because they, as far as they were concerned, this was not their war. It had nothing to do with them. It was King William's War or Queen Anne's War. It was their war. We did get involved because we were British subjects. And so there was fighting in North America between American troops and French troops, since the war is between England and France. So it kind of spills over into America, and English colonists, English subjects, and French subjects in North America ended up fighting each other. Now, for the Americans, that meant the militias. I told you last time about the militias, which are the basis of America's defense. The way that England provided for defense of its colonies in America was through assembly. It was through the militias. They never sent regular troops here. That would have cost money, and they don't want to, as I told you, they don't want to spend money on their American colonies. So they said to the Americans, you provide for your own defense. As I told you, for most of the time, the militias were nothing more than sort of social organizations, a chance for guys in a community to get together and just have some interaction, have some friends and fun and having a good time with your buddies in the militia. And you'd go out and you'd march around and you'd practice marching and you'd practice shooting and other stuff. But it was not very serious, and you might go your entire life as a member of a militia and never fire a gun in anger. And as I said, most of the time the only thing that the militias did was just to go out and beat up on the Indians and force them out and just generally try to make life miserable for Indians. But when we got into these wars, then all of a sudden the militias became the real thing. The militias had to go out and do some fighting. Frankly, they really were not very interested in that. Their commitment to this whole thing was a little bit soft, because this is not their war, it's King William's war. All right, we're his subjects, so we'll go off and fight for him, and we'll fight against the French, and there were battles and went back and forth. people got killed. This is a war. Those are wars, and these are tough times. But in some way, the toughest part of it was that the assemblies, which normally spend very little or no money on the militia, suddenly now had to spend a lot of money. They had to buy a lot of supplies. They had to find some way to buy ammunition and so forth, and food and so forth for the troops. And to do that, they had to do something that nobody liked. They had to raise taxes. And so that maybe the main reason these wars were not popular in America is just the idea that it means that we have to raise our taxes, which the assemblies don't like to do and the members of the colony don't like to do, but that's what went on. And we did this 3 different times. Well, we conquered some territory up in Canada from the French, and then the people who lived there were forced out and had to go down to Louisiana. And you know, there was stuff that went on. These are not just non-wars, these are real deals, but overall this is something that there's not a great deal of interest in or attention to. These are not considered real issues for us. We'll do it because we're British subjects and we love our king. We're loyal to the king. We're loyal British subjects. So we'll go off and fight, but it's not our war. And then that changed. And it changed primarily because of, I told you the answer last time of what explains a lot of things. It changed because of money. Surprise, surprise. And the money was from the fur trade. Now, I talked about the fur trade at the very beginning, and this trade was extremely lucrative. It was a high-risk trade. There were all kinds of things that could go wrong with it. You know, you could get a whole cargo of furs, and then they'd be lost at sea, or there'd be a storm that would water would get down into the hold, and the whole cargo would be destroyed if the furs got wet. They'd go bad, and the furs were a risky trade, but if everything worked, you'd make a lot of money on it. It was extremely profitable. As I told you, for many years, the French sort of had their hands in control of the fur trade in North America. The French were here first. Most of the trading was up in what is now Canada. It kind of crept down into upstate New York. And then the furs were found, the little animals were found out in the Ohio Valley. And they were found across a wide range. And even as early as the 1720s and 1730s, people were trading fur with the Blackfeet Indians all the way out in Montana. I like to get that in as a former resident of Montana. So fur trade is a big trade, very important, and it's the French. Well, look, the English are there, and the English can see that there's a very profitable trade going on. So England tried to get into this trade also. And so English fur traders were moving into areas that had been traditionally controlled by the French, and the French pretty much had the Indians as their partners. English merchants started going in, trying to negotiate with Indians, trying to offer Indians deals to convince them to stop trading with the French and to start trading with them. And by the 1740s, 1750s, the fur trade has become a big part of the whole economy of the British colonies, especially in the north, especially in New York and the New England colonies, which butt on the French territories of what is now Canada. But down into the Ohio Valley, which also was part of the French Empire. The French Empire, just for geography's sake, included all of Canada and then all of the rest of North America west of the Appalachian Mountains. If you know where the Appalachians are, that's a line just down the, sort of the middle of the English colonies. And everything to the east of that was the English, everything to the west of that was French. And as I said, extended all the way out to the west coast. There's disputes on the Pacific Ocean between the French and the British and the Spanish, but that's over there. And as far as we're concerned, the French controlled all that vast territory. But and so there are French settlements throughout that area. There's still a lot of French names west of the Appalachians, cities like St. Louis and New Orleans and Detroit and Vincennes. There's a lot of French names out there. There's French names all the way out in Montana, Chouteau, that indicate French involvement in the fur trade, but they don't have many settlers. They don't have many full-time farmers. It's mostly just fur trading posts. Cities like St. Louis, where there was a city there, but the basis of the city was a trading post for the fur trade coming down the Missouri River. There were French settlers in the area around Montreal on the St. Lawrence Valley. There were people living there who were small farmers, but their numbers were very much smaller than those in the British Empire. But now English fur traders are moving in, and so there's a rivalry between the British fur traders and the French fur traders. This is competition. A lot of it is, as I was telling you, it's a competition to have alliances with Indians. And so part of what the French, or what the English are doing, in order to have allies, they're offering bribes to Indian leaders to come and trade with them instead of the French, and this is leading to dissension among the Indians. There are Indians who are aligning themselves with the French, or maintaining their alliances with the French. And then there are Indians who are changing and coming over and aligning themselves with the British. Well, this competition, which is an economic competition, leads, without getting into the details, leads to war. In 1756, formal official war breaks out between England with a bunch of allies and France with a bunch of allies on its side. This war is going to be called the 7 Years' War, and there's kind of an interesting reason why they called it the 7 Years' War. It turned out to last 7 years, from 1756 to 1763. Sometimes in this country it was called the French and Indian War because we, the British subjects, were fighting against the French with their Indian allies. And we had our allies, the Indians on our side, but we call it sometimes the French and Indian War. And this is a full-scale war. This was a major war, and unlike the 3 previous wars, this war started in America. This was our war. This was not because King William is involved in some diplomatic alliances with the northern German states, and the French don't like that, and so there's a war between France and England over the policies of King William that have nothing to do with us. This is directly concerned with us. And because it started here in America, it started as a result of the competition for control of the very, very lucrative fur trade. Eventually it spread to the entire world. It's a world war. As I said, England and France both had allies. For instance, Portugal was an ally of England. Spain was an ally of France. Portugal and Spain have rivalries in South America between Brazil, which was a Portuguese colony, and Paraguay, which was a Spanish colony. There's fighting down in South America along the boundaries between Paraguay and Brazil, where where Spanish and Portuguese soldiers are fighting, and that's all part of this whole big picture of the 7 Years' War. There was fighting in Africa, there was fighting in Asia, There was a lot of fighting at sea. The French Navy and the British Navy were engaged in some major naval battles, very serious, big battles with lots of ships involved, lots of damage, lots of deaths. And it all started because of the extreme profitability of the fur trade. Well, in this big war, the American contribution, as always, was through the militias. And so now militias are engaged in a level of combat unlike anything they've ever been engaged in before. And it was tough. American militias were fighting against the French. The American militias, remember, are amateurs. These are not professional soldiers. These are farmers who volunteer to be in the militia, and usually that just means all you have to do is go out and march around the square on a Saturday afternoon and look cute in your uniform, and all the girls go, ooh. And now you've got to go out and actually do some serious fighting and put your life on the line and have people shoot back at you. And the people who are shooting back at you are professional French soldiers. So it's tough. And as we look at this fighting, we would say, you know, a lot of times the militias, they tried, they did their best. They were generally fairly courageous. They went into battle with odds against them, and they went in just and fought and died. So they did their best, but they wouldn't really maybe say take this all that seriously, because they're really farmers. They're not soldiers. So they had to say, well, we'll go fight, and we'll go for a period of time. We'll fight for 6 months. And when that 6 months was up, ding, we go home. The war is over. We're only going to fight for 6 months. And British officers, British generals who are trying to sort of control the troops of the militia were very frustrated, because here you're in the middle of a battle. The battle is going on, it's raging, you're fighting, and you've got these huge battles against the French armies. And it's a killer, and all of a sudden, it's like the bell rings, and Americans get up and back up and go home. They've got a farm to take care of, so they go back home. And so that's very frustrating. And what's really frustrating for British officers is that, as a general rule, militias would not leave their home colony. If you're the militia of North Carolina, your job is to provide defense to the people of North Carolina. Those are the people who you serve. Those are the people who pay taxes to support you. You're supported by the Assembly of North Carolina, and you take your orders from the Assembly of North Carolina, and you only deal with North Carolina. And the British wanted them to go up to Canada, which, that's the end of the world. And they don't want to do that. They won't do that. And what was really frustrating for the British was that the different units of the militia would not act as a single army. There were 13 different militias, and by God, each militia had its own officers. It had its own command structure. They had their own rules. They followed their policies. They made their rules, and they ran and they fought the battles that they wanted, and they fought them the way they wanted, and to hell with all of the other militias. They don't cooperate. They don't coordinate activities. They don't work together. They don't act as a single army. And for the British officers, they're trying to get a British army going. They don't want a North Carolina plus Georgia plus Delaware plus da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da militias. They want one army, and they don't have it. They've got 13 militias that would not work together, would not cooperate. Now this is really to me, a very interesting kind of a development, because, we've had 13 assemblies running 13 independent colonies forever. And there were some Americans who said, you know, we need to act together. We need to have some sort of cooperation to act as Americans, not just be Pennsylvanians and New Yorkers and New Jerseyans or whatever. We should try to act as Americans, at least in some respect. One of the guys who was pushing this is fairly well known to probably most of you. You've heard his name, Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was a leading member of the Pennsylvania Assembly. He'd been born in Boston, but as a young man he moved to Philadelphia. And he's very prominent and highly respected in the Pennsylvania Assembly. And in 1754, just 2 years before the war began, he and some of his friends said, you know what? We should get together and talk about some way to act as sort of an American unit, to have some formal lines of coordination, of communication among the 13 of us. So they had a meeting in Albany, New York. And they went up to Albany, and there's a bunch of guys, and the leading person there is sort of the guy who's the founder of it and the author of it and the prominent person who's pushing for this. Ben Franklin, well known and well respected. Ben Franklin and his buddies produced what they called the Albany Plan of Union. The Albany Plan of Union. And this was some sort of an agreement among the 13 colonies, and each of the assemblies would approve it and adopt it and formally become part of it. And it would provide it for some sort of level of cooperation among the 13. There was some sort of a kind of a super assembly. They would all send delegates to this sort of body that would act as sort of a coordinating body for all 13 of them. And it wouldn't do very much. It would just sort of try to have them all sort of consult and act together in certain ways. But in particular, it could act as some sort of a supervisory body over their militias. This assembly would be sort of a way to have the militias work if necessary. Remember, this is before the war has begun. But if necessary, they could act as some sort of a coordinating body of the 13 militias. And the Albany Plan of Union was emphatically, totally rejected by all of the 13 assemblies. Franklin came home to his home assembly in Pennsylvania, and his fellow delegate says, "Ben, what the hell were you doing? Have you lost your mind? Do you want us to get into something where we won't have control? We'll have this other body sort of looking us over? No way!" And the Albany Plan of Union just crashed and burned without anybody ever accepting it, and it was a total failure. And that was the way things happened then. Now then, here, just 2 years later, we needed it. We could have used it. And we didn't have it. The Plan of Union, the Albany Plan of Union, had been rejected. So that's a reason why, frankly, the war is not going well. And the Americans just don't cooperate together. So this is a very interesting development that went nowhere. So the assemblies continued to run things, the militias continued to go on, and the war, as I said, went poorly. The militias had some successes. At times they fought very well and they did their best, but other times they just couldn't get together, and it's not going well. Overall, for the whole British operation, the war is not going well, and things are looking poor. In England, a new guy came to power within the English Parliament, and he took over and he started to say, we've got to do a better job of fighting this war. His name was William Pitt. He was a very prominent member of Parliament, highly regarded, very bright, but to be honest, William Pitt came from a very prominent family, but the family had mental health issues. One of his sisters spent her entire life in a sanitarium because she was, we would call her today mentally ill. And her family was rich, and so she was treated very well, but she couldn't live by herself. She was had this, and there were times when William Pitt had flashes of insanity. He would just have, had relapses or something. So that was a problem. But when he was on, he was very bright and very capable, and he set up the way that you run it as all the details of management and organization and financing and everything. And he said, we got to fight this war better. And among other things, we've got to send real soldiers over to America. The militias, they're nice guys, but they're not pros, they're amateurs. So we've got to send some professional soldiers. So England sent regular army troops, which were, and we'll all use the term, many of you have heard this name for them, it's not a very accurate term, but it's a familiar term, so I'll use it. These are called the Redcoats. And eventually, Redcoats, professional soldiers from England, carried on the bulk of the fighting. And it turned out, by 1763, England won. And that's going to be the start of the end for the British Empire. Now, I've been forgetting to add my question at the end of the class, so here it is for today. The question you have to write is, what was the effort initiated by Ben Franklin to have American cooperation on certain issues, including the military? So that'll be, you can write that in a couple of words and send that in as part of your reply to the Canvas. And we'll take up from the British victory in the 7 Years' War in 1763.